The morning mist had not yet lifted from the fields when Alara Voss was woken by her mother's voice, flat and businesslike, as though announcing the weather rather than her daughter's fate. "Get dressed, the White One, today is the day." Ilara did not need to ask what day her mother meant. Every child in the village of Ashwell grew up knowing the story of the tribute, the old treaty signed generations ago, between the human villages and the shifter packs of Blackthorn Vale. Once every 10 years, one woman would be given to the Alpha King to keep the peace between their two worlds. It was spoken of like a tax, like a debt owed to the land itself, and this year the debt had come due. She had always assumed, in some quiet corner of her heart, that it would never be her. She was the second daughter, plain where her sister Wren was admired, quiet where Wren was clever with words. But that morning, watching her mother lay out the white dress without meeting her eyes, she understood with sudden clarity that she had never truly been a daughter to this family. She had been kept, the way one keeps a spare coin, until the day it was needed to pay off something else. "Why me?" she asked, though she already knew there would be no honest answer. Her mother folded the dress over her arm, and finally looked at her, and there was no sorrow in her face, only a kind of tired relief. "Wren is to be married next spring. You know that. This is simply how it must be." Her father did not even come to say goodbye. He stood in the doorway of the barn as the cart was prepared, arms crossed, watching the horizon, as if his daughter were already gone. The dress was plain but clean, a pale ceremonial white that the village elders insisted upon, a color meant to signify purity and offering. Ilara stood still while her mother fastened the buttons at her back, feeling strangely calm, the way a person feels calm when there is nothing left to fight for. By the time the cart rolled toward the edge of Blackthorn Forest, the sun had barely cleared the trees, and her family had already turned back toward the village, their duty discharged, their conscience apparently light. She was left at the treaty stone, an ancient marker carved with symbols older than the village itself, and told to walk forward until she was met. No one waited to see if she obeyed. No one waited to see if she survived. The forest was quieter than she expected. She had grown up hearing stories of the Alpha King, tales meant to frighten children into obedience. He was said to be a monster wrapped in a man's shape, merciless to those who crossed him, indifferent to those who served him. The women who had gone before her, according to village legend, had either become his most trusted attendants or vanished entirely, and no one seemed to know which. Ilara walked for nearly an hour before she heard footsteps that were not her own. She stopped, her heart hammering despite her outward calm, and watched as a tall figure emerged from between the dark trees. He was not what she expected. There was no monstrous shape, no visible cruelty stamped across his face. He was simply a man, broad-shouldered and dark-haired, dressed in clothing far simpler than she imagined a king would wear. His eyes, however, held her in place, sharp and searching, as though he were reading something written beneath her skin. "You are the tribute," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she answered, lifting her chin because she refused to let her voice shake. He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, though she could not name what it was. "Walk with me," he said finally, and turned without waiting to see if she would follow. She followed, because there was nothing else to do. The castle of Blackthorn Vale was carved into the mountainside itself, ancient stones softened by centuries of ivy and moss. It should have been imposing, and in some ways it was, but there was also a strange warmth to it, torchlight flickering gently along the corridors, the distant sound of voices and laughter drifting from somewhere within. It did not feel like the lair of a monster. King Draven led her to a private chamber, not a dungeon as she had feared, and gestured for her to sit. She did, cautiously, watching him with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust kindness, offered without explanation. "You are frightened," he observed, taking the seat across from her. "Wouldn't you be?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Something almost like amusement flickered across his face. "I have been called many things. Frightened is rarely one of them." "Then perhaps you don't understand what it means to be given away," she said, and the words came out sharper than she intended, years of quiet resentment finally finding a voice. "My family didn't send me here because the treaty demanded it. They sent me because I was the easiest one to lose." Draven was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. The treaty does not demand a sacrifice, Elara Voss. She blinked, startled that he knew her name, and startled further by what he had said. What do you mean? The tribute tradition was written generations ago by my father, and it was never meant to be what it became. It was meant to be an exchange of goodwill, a woman chosen and honored, sent to live among us as a bridge between our peoples, free to return home if she wished. Somewhere along the way, the village elders twisted it into something else. A punishment, a way to remove daughters they no longer wanted, dressed up as duty. Elara felt something cold settle in her chest. You're saying my family didn't have to give me up? I am saying, Draven said carefully, that your family chose the easiest sacrifice, then called it fate. The words landed harder than she expected, confirming something she had always suspected but never allowed herself to fully believe. She looked away, blinking back the sting in her eyes, refusing to let a stranger see her cry over people who had never once cried over her. I won't hurt you, Draven said quietly, watching her carefully. You are free to stay the night in comfort, and in the morning, you may choose to return home, or remain here as a guest, under my protection, with no obligation of any kind. Why would you offer that? She asked, suspicious of kindness she had not earned. He hesitated, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked almost uncertain. Because the moment I saw you at the Treaty Stone, something in me recognized you. It is difficult to explain to someone unfamiliar with our ways, but among my kind, there are bonds that form beyond choice or explanation. I felt it the instant our eyes met. Elara did not fully understand what he meant, but she understood enough to feel her breath catch. A bond. A mate bond, he said simply. It does not happen often, and it cannot be forced or faked. It simply is. She should have been afraid. Instead, she found herself studying his face, searching for the cruelty the village stories had promised her, and finding none. And if I don't want it? Then it changes nothing about how you are treated here, he said firmly. The bond does not obligate you to me. It only means that I will not lie to you, and I will not let anyone here cause you harm. They spoke for hours that night, longer than Elara had spoken honestly with anyone in years. She told him about growing up invisible in her own home, about watching her sister receive praise for things Elara had done first and better, about the quiet ache of being loved conditionally, if at all. He listened without interrupting, without offering hollow comfort, simply present in a way no one in her life had ever been. He told her about his own burdens, the weight of ruling a kingdom that feared him more than it understood him, the loneliness of a throne that offered protection, but rarely companionship. He told her that many in his court whispered he would never take a mate, that his heart was too guarded, his patience too thin. He told her that meeting her had unsettled every assumption he held about himself. Somewhere in the depths of that long night, fear gave way to something gentler. Elara found herself laughing at something he said, a real laugh, unguarded and surprised out of her, and she saw something in his expression soften at the sound, as though he had been waiting his whole life to hear it. You could have anyone, she said quietly, near dawn, unable to stop the doubt that crept back in. Why would you choose someone your treaty was designed to discard? Draven reached across the small distance between them, not touching her, simply resting his hand near hers. An offer, rather than a demand. Because you were never meant to be discarded, Elara. You were meant to be found. Your family's cruelty does not define your worth, it only reveals theirs. She did not have words for what she felt in that moment, only the quiet, steady certainty that something in her life had finally shifted towards something true. As the first light of dawn touched the mountains, Draven rose and left the room briefly, returning with something in his hands that made her breath still in her chest. It was a crown, simple and ancient, forged of dark silver, worn only by the queens of Blackthorn Vale. I will not force this upon you, he said gently. But if you would have me, I would have you stand beside me, not as a sacrifice, not as a duty fulfilled, but as my equal and my chosen mate. Elara thought of her family, of the cart that had carried her away without a single backward glance, of a lifetime spent believing she was worth less than the people around her. And she thought of this strange, quiet night, of a man who had offered her truth instead of cruelty, choice instead of obligation, and a kind of love she had never been given the chance to imagine. Yes, she said softly, and then again, with more certainty, yes. He placed the crown upon her head with careful hands, and something in her chest settled into place, as though she had finally been returned to where she belonged. By the time the sun had fully risen over Blackthorn Vale, word had already begun to spread through the village of Ashwell that the tribute had not vanished as the others once had. She had returned to the Treaty Stone, not as a broken girl sent home in shame, but standing tall in ceremonial robes, the crown of the Alpha King's queen resting upon her head, Draven beside her, his hand steady at her back. Her parents arrived at the border with confusion written across their faces, prepared to offer some explanation for a daughter they assumed would never return. Instead, they found themselves kneeling before the very girl they had thrown away, unable to meet her eyes. Alara looked at them for a long moment, feeling neither the hatred she once expected, nor the desperate need for their approval that had shaped so much of her childhood. She felt only a quiet, settled peace. "You gave me away because you believed I was the easiest to lose," she said, her voice steady in the morning light, "but I was found by someone who saw what you never did." She did not linger for their apologies, did not need them to complete the person she had become overnight. She turned instead toward the mountain, toward the man who had chosen her not out of duty, but out of truth, and walked beside him back into the kingdom that had already begun to call her queen. Behind her, the Treaty Stone stood as it always had, ancient and unmoving, a symbol of an old tradition that had once been twisted into cruelty. But for the first time in generations, it marked not an ending, but a beginning, the story of a girl who had been sent away as a sacrifice, and who had risen, by dawn, as something far greater than anyone had ever allowed her to be.